the day Harlan Decker lost everything. It rained so hard in Edmonton that the gutters on Jasper Avenue overflowed and pooled against the curb like small gray lakes. He stood outside the building where he had worked for 22 years and watched the water rise around his shoes. Good shoes, Italian leather, the kind a man buys when he believes the world owes him something. And he did not move. He just stood there. People walked past him with umbrellas. Nobody stopped. He had been worth $4.3 million that morning. By 3 in the afternoon, his accounts had been frozen, his partner had vanished, and his lawyer was not returning calls. By evening, he was standing in the rain. Harlan was 54 years old. He had built Decker Nair Construction from a two-man operation, working out of a rented garage in St. Albert into one of the mid-sized commercial contractors that developers in Edmonton and Calgary actually called back. He had not inherited the business. He had not married into money. He had worked 6-day weeks for a decade straight, driven his own truck to job sites, learned to read a structural drawing at age 37, because he needed to understand what his engineers were telling him, and he refused to pretend otherwise. He was not a flashy man. He did not throw parties or collect cars. What he had built, and then he trusted the wrong person. Craig Nair had been his business partner for 11 years. They had met on a job site in Sherwood Park. Craig was the site supervisor. Harlan was doing the electrical subcontracting. And there had been something about the way Craig talked to the trades workers, with respect, without condescension, that made Harlan think, this is a man I could work beside. They shook hands on a partnership in a Tim Hortons on a Tuesday in March and never looked back. Or so Harlan believed. What Craig had actually been doing, for the better part of 3 years, was moving money. Not in the dramatic way people imagine when they hear the word embezzlement, not suitcases or offshore accounts, at least not at first. It was smaller than that and therefore harder to see. Inflated invoices from shell vendors. Payments to contractors that did not exist. Petty cash that was neither petty nor tracked. Harlan had trusted Craig with the finances because Craig had a head for numbers and Harlan did not, and that trust had cost him everything he had spent 22 years building. The fraud investigation took 8 months. By the time it was over, the company assets were seized, the bank accounts untangled, and the CRA had questions that required a very expensive accountant to answer. Craig was eventually charged. He pled guilty to fraud over $5,000 and received a sentence that Harlan found so inadequate he stopped reading about it. His wife, Pauline, left in the 3rd month. That is the part that still catches people off guard when they hear this story. Not the bankruptcy, not Craig. People understand betrayal by a business partner in a way they can almost rationalize. Money makes people do things. Pressure makes people do things. They tell themselves. But a wife, after 19 years of marriage, after the house in Glenora and 2 kids through university and every shared ordinary morning of nearly 2 decades, Pauline did not leave dramatically. That, perhaps, was the hardest part. There was no screaming, no accusations. She sat across from him at the kitchen table, the same table where they had eaten 10,000 meals, where their daughter Maggie had done her homework, where Harlan had spread out blueprints too big for the office, and she told him, in a quiet voice, that she did not see how they could go forward, that she had thought about it, that she thought it was better to be honest now than to pretend. He asked her what exactly she was being honest about. She said she had not signed up for starting over at 52. She said it with genuine sadness, not cruelty, which somehow made it worse. She moved in with sister in St. Albert. Their son, Brett, who was 24 and had recently started in finance in Calgary, called Harlan twice in the first 2 weeks, and then the calls tapered off to once a month, then once every few months. Then Harlan stopped tracking. Maggie, at least, called regularly. She lived in Vancouver and worked in healthcare and had her mother's practical nature and her father's stubbornness in equal measure. She called every Sunday, without fail. It was a small thing that mattered enormously. But the silence in the house that was sold 6 months later to cover debts, was a physical presence. Harlan would sit in the kitchen after dark and hear nothing but the refrigerator hum and the distant sound of a neighbor's dog, and he would understand, in a way he had never quite understood anything before, what it meant to be completely alone. He moved into a bachelor apartment on 107th Avenue in the spring. It was a small building with thin walls and a parking lot that smelled like exhaust, and the superintendent was a man named Phil who watched hockey at high volume every night and left his boots in the hallway. Harlan's apartment had one window that looked out onto the side of another building. He had a single bed, a small table, a second-hand chair he found on Kijiji, and a box of books he hadn't opened in years. He had nothing on the walls. It did not look like somewhere a person lived so much as somewhere a person waited. He was 54 years old. He had no company, no savings, mounting legal fees, and a credit score that required explanation. He applied for work and found that the industry remembered the fraud investigation, even if the courts had cleared his name entirely. Doors that should have opened didn't. He was overqualified for entry-level positions and under-resourced for anything requiring capital. The world, which had once made room for him, had quietly closed the gap. It was during this period that he began eating lunch at a food truck parked on 104th Street near the City Hall Plaza. The truck was called Lavande, the French word for lavender, and it was painted a faded periwinkle blue with hand-lettered specials in white chalk on a board hung from the window. It served what the menu described as comfort food from no particular place, which turned out to mean thick soups, toasted sandwiches, and a roasted vegetable plate with a tahini drizzle that Harlan thought was the best thing he had eaten in months, though his standards had admittedly fallen. The woman who ran it was named Sable Okonkwo-Thiessen. She was perhaps 40, with natural hair pinned back under a bandana and the unhurried manner of someone who had made peace with working hard. The first time Harlan came to the window, he counted out exact change from a wallet that had more compartments than contents. Sable took the coins without comment, handed him his soup, and said, "Have a good afternoon." He did not have a particularly good afternoon, but he appreciated that she'd wished him one. He came back the next Tuesday and the one after that. There is something about a regular customer that a good food vendor notices. Not their order, though that too, but the way they carry themselves. Whether they look up when they approach or keep their eyes down. Whether they say thank you like they mean it or like it's punctuation. Harlan said thank you like he meant it, which he did, because at that point in his life, a good bowl of soup was something he was genuinely grateful for. After several weeks, they began to talk. Nothing revealing at first. The weather, the construction cranes that were appearing along White Avenue, a pothole on 103rd that had taken out 3 of her delivery arrangements because her supplier refused to make the turn anymore. Harlan knew enough about city permitting to mention the right department name, and she laughed and said, "I've been calling the wrong people for 2 months." She told him a little about the truck. She had started it 4 years earlier after leaving a restaurant kitchen where she had worked for the last 2 as sous chef, before the head chef was replaced by someone whose management style she described as efficient, in the way a controlled burn is efficient. She had borrowed money from her mother and her aunt and a friend in Montreal who believed in her, and she had bought a used truck and a commercial kitchen license and had been on 104th Street ever since. Her husband, Damien, handled the weekend bookings and the social media. Her daughter, who was 7, was named Clara and had strong opinions about soup names. Harlan listened and did not offer his own story for a long time. He was not ready for it. He was still too close to the wreckage, but one afternoon in November, a cold one, the kind where the sky over Edmonton goes the color of old pewter and the wind off the river flats has genuine intention, he arrived at the truck and found Sable looking at a document on her phone with an expression he recognized. It was the expression of someone doing math that will not come out right. He asked if she was okay. She looked up and seemed to consider whether to answer. Then she said, "I have a commissary kitchen fee due by the end of the week, and the October bookings came in short." "It's fine. I'll figure it out," he said. "How short?" She looked at him. He said, "I used to run a construction company. I understand cash flow gaps." She told him the number. He did not wince, though it was not a small number for someone in his position. He said, "Do you have the documents you'd need for a small bridge loan?" "Not a bank. I know a credit union manager who owes me a conversation." Sable looked at him for a moment. She said, "I don't even know your last name." He said, "Harlan Decker. And I'm not offering charity. I'm offering an introduction. You'll have to do the work yourself. But the door will open." It opened. The credit union came through. Sable made the commissary payment, weathered the slow month, and by the spring was doing her best numbers yet. A corporate lunch contract with a building on 108th, a standing Saturday spot at a farmer's market in Westmount, a write-up in a local food blog that brought in the kind of customers who photograph their meals and mean it as a compliment. She thanked Harlan the next time she saw him. He said there was nothing to thank. She said there was. He left Edmonton that following spring. Maggie had asked him to come to Vancouver for a few months. She had space, she said, and she thought a change of environment might help him think about what came next. He was not sure anything would come next, not in the way he had once understood the phrase, but he went. He needed to go somewhere. The streets did not carry the weight of what had happened to him. He found work in Vancouver in a slow, unglamorous way. A friend of a friend needed someone to manage a small residential renovation project. Not a company, just one house, cash flow minimal. Harlan did it well because he could not do work any other way. That led to another project, and then a referral, and then a modest arrangement with a small development firm that needed someone who understood the trades and could talk to a permit officer without losing their temper. He was not rebuilding his old life. He was building a different, smaller one in a different city, and he was not sure yet whether that was a defeat or simply a revision. He turned 56. He turned 57. Maggie got engaged to a man named Theo Kamau, an emergency room physician who was quiet and competent and who listened to Harlan's stories about job sites with what appeared to be genuine interest. Brett called more often. For no apparent reason Harlan could identify. Perhaps he had grown up enough to be sorry. Perhaps he had simply grown up. Harlan took the calls and did not press. He was no longer in a position to hold anything too tightly. He thought about Pauline sometimes. Not with anger anymore. The anger had burned out somewhere around the second year, leaving behind something he did not have an exact word for. Not forgiveness, exactly. More like the recognition that he had also changed and that the man she had left would not have survived what came next anyway. Maybe she had known something he hadn't. It was in the third spring in Vancouver, late April, that his phone rang with an Edmonton number he did not recognize. It was Sable. She had tracked him down through Maggie's social media, she explained, which she felt was slightly embarrassing but necessary. She had thought about calling for months and kept not doing it, and then decided that was cowardly. She told him she had something to tell him. The commissary loan he had helped her secure 4 years earlier, the introduction, the door, had been the turning point for Lavande. The corporate contract had renewed 3 times. She had opened a second location, a small brick-and-mortar on White Avenue, with a dining room that seated 22. She had hired 4 people full-time. Clara, who was now 11, had named the house specialty, a roasted squash bisque, and it was on the menu with a small note that said, "Clara's idea." Damien had quit his logistics job to work alongside her. She said, "I don't think I would have made it past that November without your help. And I know you went through something very hard after that. I know it didn't end the way it should have for you. I wanted you to know that what you did mattered. That it changed something real." Harlan sat in his apartment in Vancouver, a better apartment now, with 2 windows and a small balcony where he'd put a single plant that was somehow still alive, and he did not know what to say. Then she said, "I want to offer you something, and I hope you'll hear it as what it is. I'm opening a 3rd location. I need someone who understands permits, contractors, project timelines, budget management. I've had quotes that don't add up and tradespeople who don't return calls and a landlord making promises that aren't in writing. I need someone who has done this before and who I trust. The pay is fair, the work is real. And I think it would give you a reason to come back to Edmonton." He was quiet for a long moment. She said, "You don't have to decide now," he said. "I think I need 48 hours, she said. "Take 72. He took 60. Then he called her back and said yes. He drove back to Edmonton in May, which is perhaps the best month in that city. The long, northern light stretching past 9 in the evening, the river valley in full green, the construction season just starting up, and the air carrying that particular smell of fresh concrete and cut lumber that Harlan had known since he was 22 years old, and which meant, to some part of him that lived below language, that there was work to be done. Sable met him at the new location on a Thursday morning. It was a former cafe space on 124th Street. Good bones, poor plumbing, a drop ceiling that would need to come out. She had coffee waiting. She handed him the lease, the contractor quotes, the permit, quote, the permit applications she had started and stalled on. He looked at them for a long time. Then he said, "The dropped ceiling is hiding something. Either good news or a problem. Let's find out which." She laughed. He had not heard himself make someone laugh in a while. They found out it was a problem, a moisture issue behind the north wall that required an extra 3 weeks and a specialist. But they also found original pressed tin panels above the drop ceiling, the kind that cost a small fortune to reproduce, and which, restored, gave the space a warmth that no renovation budget could have manufactured. Sable stood under them on the day they were cleaned and looked up for a long time without saying anything. The third Lavande location opened in September, on a cool, bright Saturday, with a line out the door that Harlan watched from across the street. Sable's mother was there. Damien was behind the bar. Clara was at the host stand, taking it very seriously. People from the food blog came. The corporate client sent flowers. Harlan did not go in that morning. He stood across the street and watched people walk through the door, and he felt something he had not felt in a long time. Not happiness, exactly, or not only that. More like the recognition that he was standing on solid ground. That the ground had come back, that it had come from a direction he never would have predicted. A chalk-lettered menu, a woman counting invoices in November, a bowl of soup on a cold gray Tuesday when the world had closed every other door. He crossed the street eventually. Sable saw him come in and waved from across the room. Her daughter Clara, very seriously, asked if he had a reservation. He said he did not. Clara considered this. Then she said, "That's okay. I'll find you a spot." She did. It was a table near the window, with light coming in and a view of the street, and a small vase with 3 sprigs of dried lavender that smelled, faintly, of something beginning. He sat down and waited for someone to bring him a menu. He was in no hurry. For the first time in a long time, he had nowhere else to be, and that was not a loss. It was, at last, something else entirely.